I think we'll go ahead and get started and kick this thing off. Welcome, everybody. My name is Peter. I'm the program director here at Amplify Arts, and I'm really happy to welcome you all to tonight's Alternate Currents panel discussion and our official book launch for Given All This: Collective Institutional Futures. Tonight we'll be talking with members of our 2021 Alternate Currents Working Group. And I just want to take a minute to thank the Sherwood Foundation, whose support makes programs like this possible. For anybody who's new to Amplify, our mission is to promote unity, progress, and innovation in the cultural sector, and Alternate Currents is one program that helps us do that by bringing national and international conversations in the arts down to the local level with responses from people working on the ground. That happens in a few different ways. There's a blog, an online component that you're welcome to visit anytime. There's this bi-monthly discussion series, which we're all participating in tonight. And there's a artist working group of about 10 artists and culture workers who get together and collaborate and work in response to the year's theme. In 2021, our working group dedicated the year to investigating the idea of institutional futures. And in the context of our group, we looked at cultural institutions of all shapes and sizes. But during our monthly sessions, we discussed and made work in response to arts economies, organizational hierarchies, cultural labor, and museum collections specifically. Interestingly, our conversations moved away from institutional frameworks pretty quickly, and instead toward establishing a shared set of values that might anchor the relationships between artists and cultural institutions, the ethics around growth and progress, and our understanding of Omaha as an indigenous place. Amplify's positionality in these discussions as a nonprofit organization that directly benefits from racial and ecological injustices, which continue to line the pockets of folks who fund nonprofit institutions, whether that be individuals, government agencies, or foundations, is complicated and fraught with a lot of questions. Our goal with this artist working group specifically was to listen, to learn, and to better understand how we could support a meaningful decentralization of wealth and power in the cultural sector. So no easy answers, no nicely packaged solutions, but a real gift came in the form of each group member's work and the contributions they made to the book, which is right here. So we'll talk more about their work and their individual contributions in just a minute, but first I'd like to introduce Annika Johnson, who is our co-facilitator for this program. She's going to be guiding tonight's conversation with this really incredible group of artists and thinkers. I'm going to quickly introduce them to you as well in alphabetical order. And if you'll just wave for a second when I call out your name so people can put a face to a name, that would be great. We have Corson Androski, Katie Bettin, Jody Boyer, Allegra Hangen, Jared Packard, Ilaamen Pelshaw, and Lillian Snortland. So they'll be in conversation with one another for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions at the end of the discussion. But until then, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat functions. Those will be active throughout the entire discussion. There will also be a video and a transcript of this discussion up on the Alternate Currents blog in a couple weeks. We'll post more resources there, and feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section and help us keep this conversation going. Our website is amplifyarts.org. You can find the blog there. So thank you again for being here. We really appreciate your support and your participation in critical discussions like this. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Annika.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. This is really a wonderful group of artists, and I think you're in for a treat. I wish that, you all had this in your hands. Like Peter said, you can get your copies in a number of places, including on Amplify Art's website. We were just talking as we were preparing for the panel, how nice it is to be able to see the product of your artistic labors in a published format. So I hope all of the group members here feel really proud of what they worked on this year. I'm Annika. I was co-facilitator throughout this session, throughout this year. I wear many hats. One of those hats is I curate the Native American art collection at Joslin Art Museum, but I also love working with artists. So having discussions around how, we as artists, culture workers, curators can engage with our place, with our communities, etc. So one of the pleasures of co-facilitating a working group like this is to really witness how the conversations evolve over the course of the year. When Peter and I were initially thinking of the theme, it's institutional futures. There's a different theme for each working group. And we began the conversation with this group with a reading about capital IC institutional critique, which is, broadly an artistic practice of critiquing museums and galleries that began in the 1960s and has really shifted over the decades. But the group took the conversation in the direction that related to their work, and they showed that through their practice, their interest didn't really lie with capital I institutions necessarily, but rather in collectivity and thinking about institutional structures, but also just how community can organize, forms of organizing, healing, and collaboration. So this is really reflected in the title of the publication, and I think Peter's going to bring up some images here. So you can see the design, institutional is crossed out. So it's changed to collective futures, which really encapsulates the group's thinking and the group's work. Like I said, each year the groups contribute to a final project. So all 10 members of our working group were given 10 or so pages to do whatever they want. And we organized the project into 3 overlapping themes. The first is called Who Needs Who the Most? And it's about reimagining artist relationships with institutions or with organizations. We had a section called The Labor of Care, which is about its capacity to propose regenerative modes of artistic production. And you can really get a sense as you're looking at the pages, the contributions were visual, there were interviews, essays, we have panel discussions interspersed throughout the pages as well, transcripts of those. And then the final part is called This Land, and it's about reorienting settler narratives. So the goal is to better understand Omaha as an Indigenous place. So with that, this will give you a sense. We can pull up images throughout our discussion, but I think I'll kick off conversations. So we opened the first session with the prompt. Imagine you walk into a museum, a gallery, a classroom, an urban farm event in 2050, and what does it look like? So after thinking about this through a year, investigating the ins and outs of cultural institutions, nonprofits, grassroots organizations, I want to hear from all of you how your relationship to cultural institutions has changed.
I guess I'll kick it off. This is kind of a hard one for me just because I wish it could be a more dramatic change. I feel like coming out, like we started this conversation in this year of dialogue in the wake of George Floyd's murder, of COVID. There was just such a cultural upheaval and huge, or just new asks being demanded of institutions, which is why this cohort was so helpful in thinking through some of those things. And I think maybe I entered with maybe a more naive, a more like a very optimistic view of like coming out with some kind of like tangible change or a course of action that we could like embark upon. And the reality is that things have been shifted in a much more subtle way. And I don't know that my relationship to institutions has changed very dramatically. What I can say is that they seem to be more like permeable or like maybe not quite as monolithic as I once thought they were. And I think that's because we did some great readings around how to critique institutions, how collective action might work. So yeah, that's just been my perspective, and I'm really curious to hear some of my cohorts take on that.
Before we connected, I was actually doing some writing about this prompt, and I completely agree with you, Jared. Like, I was expecting, I think when I came into this group, I was expecting to have this like revelatory moment where I'm like, oh my God, this is how we can change institutions. And that's not gonna, I mean, it's great like to have that ideal, but I don't think it happens that way, you know? And what I have felt is like, I am seeing large cultural institutions as much more nuanced. And I think it's like throughout our conversations and the readings that we've done and the studio visits that we've done, like I've been able, as you say, like it feels more permeable, and like this opaque image of a cultural institution doesn't feel so opaque to me anymore. It's more like I'm talking with you guys who also work in cultural institutions, who are artists that are thinking about these things. And it's giving me a lot of insight into like the behind the scenes aspect of it all. Not so much that like forward image that like the mission statement that institutions try to put out. And so I feel like I'm seeing cultural institutions, large cultural institutions, I should say too, because smaller ones are a bit more transparent already. But I'm starting to see them more nuanced, sort of like I'm seeing the workers behind that institution rather than like the face of the institution.
Yeah, those are great responses because it is subtle and nuanced. And I appreciate that honesty. And I'm wondering from the rest of you, I'm thinking Katie in particular, you were thinking about urban farms throughout your project and weren't necessarily working with, museums or large scale institutions. I'd be curious to see how your relationship changed to the kinds of organizations that you were working with or thinking about, if you had a similar experience.
Yeah, I think, and I apologize if my eyes like shift over. I did try and like write out my thoughts previously to this. So yeah, I think as I've approached the year, like coming into it, I know one of the questions on the application was like, what are my thoughts on the state of museums currently? And I was like, shoot, I gotta go talk to someone. I don't know. I haven't been to a museum in like so long. And I did. And what they shared with me was really influential in my application. It like opened my eyes to a lot of dots that I didn't even know were connected in my life. So yeah, I think, let's see. Yeah, in the way that like I've approached this year, thinking about like food justice nonprofits. I know that I have come to like a better understanding of how to look at nonprofits, be them like big or small, I think small nonprofits are even connected to, there's like a string of funding, and it just like gets bigger and it gets bigger and it compounds. So I think it is important to still be critical even of a nonprofit, regardless of its size. Yeah, so when I think of kind of how I'm like walking away from this experience, yeah, I just know that the way I approach relationships overall has changed, to institutions, but also to people. People make up institutions, and that is something that I have come to know by personal experience, but is also has been reiterated in these readings and discussions that we've had, is that a lot of this movement that is going on, be it like negative impacts or really positive movements and outcomes, are for the fact of people. And so yeah, I definitely don't feel afraid to challenge relationships, and yeah, I'm not mad about that outcome. I'm excited for it. I think growth will come from it.
That's great. And I just want to underscore that point that you just made, Katie, that people make up institutions. I think that was at the core of a lot of our conversations when we were talking about how money flows, about workers' rights, about small organizations and community. Ilaamen, Lily, or Jody, and Corson, do you have things you want to add about this shift?
So for me, the relationship with organizations was huge internally. Being from Guatemala, I always have loved museums, and we don't have large museums down there. So I think somehow I had idealized the job of a museum or the mission of a museum, and maybe somehow I thought that the best way for an artist to really know that they have made it is to be in a museum. And now reading about all the complicated relationships and all that is behind scenes, and the hard things about some large organizations, really made me think so different about art and about a good impact that an artist can do with their art, and the fact that you don't need to be in a huge museum to produce good art or to really being an artist. In fact, if you focus more in your community and how your art can provide some voice or some connections between people that can change one or two persons, that will be even more important than just kind of like the ego boost of having your art in a huge institution. So I think it was very enriching for me hearing from everybody, and don't get me wrong, it will be amazing to have your art in a museum, but hopefully the whole system or the whole disparities that are in the art world right now will change eventually, and it will be more open for more artists. So definitely it kind of like burst the bubble of what I thought originally of museums in general. So it was very deep for me to hear from you all this year.
That's fantastic. And what you described is a huge shift from seeing an institution as a force that's somehow essential to validating your practice to shifting your entire practice. If you take that out of the equation of what you do and why you do it, that's pretty foundational. So I'm excited to hear that you got a lot out of these conversations. Jody, Corson, Lily, do you want to add anything?
I can hop in. Well, this year, I suppose last year, I think that the greatest change has been me thinking, like you guys, I think more on a person-to-person and relationship basis. But for me, it took a turn into thinking about why people think the way they do at a very like core fundamental level. So really like taking the psychology back, kind of like as many layers back as I could. And because that's frankly, I think, where you're going to find the decolonization is from the very act of how we make decisions and why we make decisions before we even get to the decisions themselves. And I work within the nonprofit sphere, and I've worked in a lot of different cultural institutions by this point. And I think this year in particular has reminded me, I think, of the sort of like pride and ego that an institution has just at wanting to exist, and like this desperation to exist and thrive as like a financial thing, like living in this scarcity mindset, which then frankly gets transferred on to the people who work there, and or it's a bit of a cycle. So people work there, we bring the scarcity mindset, it continues and perpetuates. And so I think sort of working in those situations, I've been trying to think more about like, I guess humbling, trying to be humble about the institution itself, and trying to sort of have these like moments with people where it's like we need to humble ourselves as workers and also humble the institution quite a bit, if it's a large cultural institution especially, and sort of playing with that like ethical friction of being imperfect, because everywhere I worked seems afraid of admitting that we are imperfect, or like admitting fault or making concessions. But as far as I'm concerned, that is where I think the power is, and that's where the change is being able to like live in that space and continue to work in that space. So that's, I think, where I've landed and where I'm trying to stay for now, because I don't think we will get rid of these institutions right away. And I think the all or nothing, like throw the baby out with the bathwater way of thinking kind of leads to us staying the same in a lot of ways, because we're afraid if we don't have the answer, the perfect fix, that we can't do it. Like if it's not perfect, there's no point. And I think that means that we just stay in one place, and it's an excuse to stay the same.
Mm-hmm. Those are all good points, and I think they really came across in the work that you contributed to the publication, which I happen to have open to Lily's contribution. And it took a lot of different forms. There's all of the group members contributed, writing in different ways, images in different ways. But Lily, I just wanted to quote you. You have a poem, and it says, "Nothing is stagnant. We are all people of hopes and wishes." So I just think that really draws out a bit of what you're saying. And with that, I want to dive into the publication a little bit more and give you all a chance to talk about your projects. So what I'd like to hear from you all is, how did the work that you contributed to the publication question, queer, or consider alternatives to institutional frameworks?
So in my case, I did a little comic strip, several pages of comics. And it was this idea that the comic or the cartoons have been usually made for people and for communities and for everybody, not as an elite kind of communication. So I wanted to make it very light. I wanted to make it in a way that institutions usually don't present their thoughts. And it was more like a funny way to live a thought as how we can change of how we view each other. And if we really get to the point of respect and value each other as equal, is where the change will really happen. Because it's very often that we can try to mark a check or try to make these steps to go to where we're supposed to be. Like if we want to be more inclusive, well, what is the minimum that I can do so people look at me as inclusive, or so at least I can say that I did my job. But at the end, the work needs to be done very deep down. When if you don't really think that everybody is equal and that everybody deserves your respect, no matter what you do to mask your colonialist mentality, it will come up. So it was in a funny way just to say it needs to begin deep down each person. And once that change is done, then the institutions will start changing. So that was my thoughts in a very short, funny way.
It was great. And I love that your contribution, I think there was like one word in it, which is snip, but that you provided more of a visual and narrative format. And I think that, you know, the group, something that stood out to me when Peter and I shared the layouts with the group, and everybody's like, it looks too clean. So, you know, Jared's contribution to the publication is kind of interspersed throughout, of kind of marking up the pages, and of providing introductions for each of the projects in this very kind of handwritten, messy, just lively text. And I think, you know, a lot of these projects did engage with that format of the book too, as a way of kind of questioning institutions. Jared, I don't want to call on you. You can speak more to that if you want. Anybody's welcome to jump in on this question about their project.
Yeah, I guess I'll take that as an intro, especially because my project was about introductions. And I was interested in how institutions became framing devices and how like they uplift or kind of bury kind of our own histories, our own stories that we tell about ourselves. And I was thinking about kind of like, what are the essential kind of like components of a book? And one of them was like, you know, an introduction, a framing device. And so I kind of did this project where I did these, I call them like drawing writings, where they're done with charcoal on paper. And they're short descriptions, almost the way you might introduce a book or the vinyl text of an exhibition, to kind of say a few words about each of my fellow peers in the cohort, who very generously gave me permission to do this, so thank you. And I guess I was interested in like, you know, some of the, like I was using charcoal, so the materiality became really important to it, where like it would brush away, and there's some words that are kind of illegible. And I'm interested in kind of the frictions between like this insistence on creating authority and power through language by giving something meaning and purpose and direction, by giving it an introduction, and then kind of like the way that it's actually being conveyed is sometimes illegible or sometimes not totally clear, or maybe you have to read it 2 or 3 times to be like, is that an A or an E? And yeah, I think that kind of friction is really interesting and exciting, and maybe part of the challenges of kind of like of the broader conversations we're having about institutions.
Jody, I'd be curious to hear from you, because you played a pretty critical role in the group in terms of using different teaching tools, a lot of virtual tours. We were on Zoom, by the way, for most of these sessions. And Jody brought in tools to kind of organize our ideas, to think through ideas in a visual text way. And then your final project is about gathering sources. And I'd love for the audience to hear from you a little bit about that interest in, you know, bringing together and seeing what we have in our community, what's going on in the community that might be sort of overshadowed by certain conversations, certain institutions, and how you see bringing those resources together.
Sure. I don't have a copy of the book, so you'll have to hold up the sections, but I tried to use my pages as a way of creating a resource center in the book. And then the QR codes, 2 of them link to some nonprofit organizations that are focused on different economic models and moving towards more collective economic models. And then the last one is a Padlet for the group members or anyone who has the book to add resources for people to kind of dismantle colonial ideologies, dismantle scarcity ideologies, and start to think differently about how they want to live their lives. And then the last page of my section, I included a package of seeds that I had nurtured over 4 months in my garden, which is kind of the place that I go to. And it was a really interesting phenomena to see that I had a single package of seeds that I started with, and I ended up with, I think, nearly 10,000 seeds from one package of seed that I grew in my backyard. And it was such a beautiful metaphor for the abundance that is in our world when we allow it to be there and we allow it to be shared with others. And so I wanted to share those seeds out of a gesture of, you know, if everyone that has a book goes and grows that package of seeds, the multiple generations of abundance that come from that act. And that's kind of what I felt like the experience was of being part of the working group, is planting a lot of seeds and kind of seeing how the changes in our thinking and who we are will move forward as artists and people.
That's great. And I am now just making that connection to the seed packet in the back. I love that that's kind of the closing, because as all of you have articulated, you know, this is really the beginning of a discussion and kind of the seed of a new direction in your practice or of a new way of thinking. Does anybody want to add about their projects? I have many other questions. I also know our audience members might have questions. If you're tuning in, feel free to type something into either the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to try and keep my eye on both. Oh yeah, Katie.
Yeah, I think for my project, I ended up interviewing a lot of people. I kind of wanted to take, and honestly, not enough people. I need to talk to more people. I'm like, this conversation's not over. Or I don't want it to be, at least. I think there's still a lot to be said and a lot to understand. But yeah, I took a compilation of questions that I came up with and reached out to people who I know are associated with food and food production, education, cooking food in Omaha, and just really wanted a public pulse of what everyone was thinking about it. And, you know, I have my own personal thoughts about nonprofits and food production and food justice, and how that gets weird and comes off weird and comes off in ways that seem really inefficient and lacking and unconnected. So those are my thoughts. And I reached out to other people, and it came through to me that like I wasn't fully alone. So that was they were really long conversations and challenging to have. But I am really thankful that in this project I was able to bring more thoughts and minds into it. Besides, I don't really know what I would have done to produce just on my own, because I don't think that, like I said earlier, I fully understand where we're at or how we should move forward. I know that there are ideas that I have that they come and they go, and I'm like, we should do this, we should do this. But really when it comes down to it, the like, there might never be a conclusion of what is necessary to do next, but I know that that answer is not going to come through one person, especially related to food, because it affects us all. And the history related to food and where we're at now with food and food systems, it's so unguided, unknown, and yeah, honestly, no one really has a pulse on it. Like when you think of what is a food system, everyone's answer is kind of different and across the board, and it gets complicated. But I do fully believe, and I still believe after this project, that food is something that can take care of us all as humans and a planet. So yeah, I'm really appreciative to everyone who engaged with me in this project. And I learned so much, and just interacting with community. There's so much to learn, and a very necessary step.
Well, and I think you touched on something that we all thought about in the group, is that there isn't one answer, but also that the answers need to come through conversation. And you started those conversations in your project, which was really fantastic to read through the answers and to at least begin that. Like you said, there's not necessarily a roadmap or an overarching structure for all of the different ways that organizations, individuals work with food, but that conversation is a start. I want to shift to another question that kind of circles back to the initial question we had at the beginning of the working group, which is, you're in 2050, you walk into a cultural institution, or you're part of an organization, what does it look like? So maybe not going that far out into the future and being a little bit more realistic, as we've all learned to be in this group. What are some ways in which cultural institutions can shift some of their priorities, be they operational, programmatic? We looked at a lot of different models for organizing, especially for engaging with communities. How might they shift and work towards a future that's more transparent, more equitable, and more inclusive?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and like for me, it comes down to, well, in my head, it's like being a smaller organization, but maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be like a smaller institution on the scale of like employees or operations or whatever, but just, I think having a real, genuine and like non-pretentious relationship with the community is so necessary, because I feel like right now a lot of the larger institutions, like I was saying before, have their own mission statement that's like this forward facing, like this is, their statement of who they are, what they want to do. And I think a lot of times it's not actually reacting to the community and their needs. And it's sort of coming up with like this ideal community that doesn't actually exist, even saying like, this is what the community needs and we're going to address these things. But like at the end of the day, it's basically addressing like what their donors want or what is like expected of an institution at that, of whatever given scale, And so I think like really listening to and responding to the needs of the community is like, that's like the most tangible thing that I can think of, whether it's a large institution or a smaller institution. And I feel like the smaller institutions that do exist right now are doing that. Like in Omaha, I know for sure that there are multiple organizations. I wouldn't call that, I want to get away from the word institution as well. I think like organization feels really nice, or group or space. I don't know. And I know for sure that in Omaha, like I've had experiences at a few of these spaces that they're doing exactly that, and they do care like deep down for communities, and they respond to those needs, and we can see that works out really nicely. Everyone's served in that situation, both the institution and the people.
Maybe to build off of that, Allegra, I'm thinking, I can't remember which one of my fellow panelists made the comment about like the ego of the institution. And there's something inherent in like the ego and the operations of particularly cultural art institutions, which really depend on a pedigreed like tastemaker who's making the decisions of where budgets are being allocated, who's getting platformed. And so that just the operational kind of setup of these institutions is very much at odds with what you're talking about, Allegra, in terms of listening to communities and getting their ideas. So, which is like, yeah, that's the ego thing, is like, we need to challenge our ego as cultural institutions and learn how to effectively deauthorize kind of those who are supposed to have power, those who are, whether intentionally or unintentionally, end up being the gatekeepers of authority.
I think sorry, you go, you got it.
I just wanted to say one quick thing of authority and of opportunities, like that money ends up giving opportunities to certain people, and it's chosen to be given to certain people who they think can also bring that money back, and it becomes not a great cycle. Sorry, Lily, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to what you guys were saying a little. I think also thinking about space from a very just like base sense, I think that there is this, I guess, fear of letting outside people have control of what goes on inside the walls of an organization. And some don't do this, where you will have like outside curators or something like that. But I think that just having just practicing those sorts of, I guess, like programs is a really good place to start, because even that can just be pulling teeth to have any outside group have any amount of, I guess, not ownership, but I guess I would say just have freedom within an institution or an organization's space to do what they want, because that's sort of what is tied to, I think, land ownership, which really gets us back to a lot of my project was thinking about how we started from a really, really bad place with all of these cultural institutions being on claiming land, that wasn't theirs to begin with, claiming land, having authority and legitimizing the land by being cultural institutions. And I say legitimized with very big air quotes, because that is how colonialism works, is you legitimize something, whether that's by being physically written down or just having the cultural, I guess, gravitas of being a cultural institution in the first place. You have the cultural capital to say, this is mine, we deserve this space, I get to control it. And I think that instinct is kind of how we got into this boat. And so I think slowly dismantling that is important. And just from an even smaller personal thing that I've been trying to work on is I really believe that most people who are especially in fundraising, which I'm in fundraising, need to learn abolitionist theory, and they need to learn decolonization theory, because it exists out there. People teach this stuff, and it's we just have no framework for applying that to our work until we go out and learn it. So that's my 2 cents. That's what I've been thinking about lately.
Can you talk more about that, Lily? Particularly an abolitionist framework in the context of nonprofit development. What might that look like?
I think I'm still learning, so I don't want to be this is what we should be doing by any means. But personally, I think I found that everything is a lot more interconnected than one would think. And there tends to be this sort of separation where you think that I guess forwarding social movements that feel separated from art, like from art institutions. Like it doesn't make sense that they'd be connected. But I think that I've learned something every time that I have read a book about pushing boundaries and social change in every other context, not just like cultural institutions. So I think like abolitionist theory is just a good foundation for me personally. It's not for everybody necessarily, but I think that abolitionist theory helped me think about how to sort of detangle a lot of what I believed to be true and what people have told me just like makes sense for how society should be arranged, if that makes sense. So that is why I would head that direction. Also, there's just good literature out right now. I think it's being like simplified in a way that is very applicable to a lot of people's lives in a way that I think maybe it felt a little out there for yeah, I guess I should just say I think there's good literature out right now, so that's partially why I'd say go that direction.
Yeah, it's definitely becoming a more sort of prevalent and relevant part of our cultural discourse for sure. I appreciate you bringing that up. And speaking of interconnectedness, I also appreciate you bringing that point up. I wanted to ask Corson, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Corson, but since you were a participant in 2020's working group and also 2021's working group, I wondered if you could talk about any connections that you saw between what we discussed in 2020, issues around ecological justice, and what we talked about in 2021 when we discussed institutional futures.
Wait, that's a really good question. Let me think back just a little bit. This is a ways back. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind was, I don't know, a big touchstone for me that I was thinking about last year was Kyle Powis White's work, his work on the philosophy of climate change, and thinking about why settler society is and continues to fail so spectacularly in addressing this collective problem, and doing historical work thinking about the how social institutions were structured differently in indigenous nations, that and especially around the idea of institutional change. He kind of makes the point that we focus on this very much as a problem of climate change being a singular crisis, and he talks about it actually being more broadly a problem of our society not having the capacity to address change, because this is, in the grand scheme of things, just one of many apocalypses that humankind has been through. And the issue now is not that climate change is fundamentally different or worse, but that social institutions are not accountable to the people that they're meant to serve. And that lesson seems to, I mean, this is a point that Allegra just made a couple minutes ago. And this point, I think it translates really, really well to thinking about arts institutions, both in their failure to be accountable to the people that they intend to serve, the people whom their land was extracted from, who the cultural artifacts and the current work is extracted from, and also just generally sort of their failure and their capacity to change. Maybe one of the biggest things that has changed for me thinking about museums for the last year is rethinking sort of their promise of stability as being their ultimate good, as giving them the justification to own and control such a huge portion of the world's cultural works. The promise is that museums they're big, they're too big to fail, they are unchanging, they can care for this work over time and make it last forever and control and display it forever. And especially as soon as you introduce sort of a critical decolonial perspective that, it's really easy to see how that's, not the ultimate good in every case, and that there is, work that was never meant to be shown forever. And so I think this was a point also Lillian made in a previous panel about, big arts institutions' failure to change being one of the biggest roadblocks to I'm sorry, losing that train of thought. I'm trying to remember Lillian's words exactly, they're not coming to me, but yeah, I think that thinking translated really easily over to thinking about museums, and has kind of affected how I, think about Antwerp in the future and how I aspire to them. And I'm now thinking about, what work that is totally agnostic to institutions might look like. And I kind of stumbled into that with a project at the beginning of the year where, it was a project that originally was just a classroom exercise that, could work in any room, and I adapted to work in a gallery, but is something that I think I could still do regardless of institutional support, even though Amplify support was invaluable in lots of ways. And I was really lucky to see actually someone else has done this exercise elsewhere. Rowe is a photographer who cited that work as something that she did outdoors. And so I don't know, the big change has just been thinking less about what am I going to make to hang in a gallery, and more what can I do and have it do good work without the certainty of, having an institution that I can trust to do that in the future or do it ethically. I'll stop there for now. That's a bunch of different points about different sessions. Yeah.
These are all really lovely, lovely responses. We're coming up to 8 o'clock, and I wanted to see, we don't have any questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to give attendees one last chance to ask anything. Oh, great. Okay, a question from David. What was the book everyone read about the different ways to approach criticism, and how did that shift their perspective? David, I don't know if you're referring to a specific book that the entire group read. I think there's probably a lot of individual responses too to material that you were working through during this process, articles, podcasts. What were some of the materials you were all looking through that really shifted your perspective?
Jared, do you have the name of that podcast offhand that you recommended for thinking about sort of the origins of museums as collecting institutions? That was really informative for me. Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it was Ariel Azulay. Did a podcast on hyperallergenic, and maybe we can drop it in the chat if someone can pull it up. But maybe to respond to David's question, I think we read an article on wage, working artists in the greater economy, that really stood out to me. I had been familiar with wage previously, but this was kind of like a deep dive into the history and origins of this organization. And as like a very quick synopsis for our audience who might not be familiar, it's an organization that basically establishes payment standards for arts nonprofits to compensate cultural labor, cultural work by primarily artists. So if you go to their website, they'll kind of break down payment structures based on an organization's overall annual operating budget, and say if your budget is $5 million, you pay, and you do a solo show, you should pay that artist blank dollars. And it sounds like really straightforward and simple, but to understand the inertia that it took to kind of like get this thing together, to maintain it and continue it operating, to understand the ways that different organizations supported it in its kind of nascent stages, I think it was really formative for me in terms of understanding how generally undervalued cultural labor is, that there even needs to be kind of like, you know, a statement on how you should compensate artists. But then also one example of how kind of collective advocacy can make a difference.
I think that ties into a question we got from Amanda. Do you have any ideas about how small, even informal organizations can stay connected with each other in a more active and collaborative way? Sometimes running an informal organization can be consuming. How can we form a stronger network across the city in between dispersed locations? That's a great question.
That's an amazing question.
Uh-huh.
I think like, I don't know. Oh man. Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to this, but I identify really strongly with this question. I think I'm constantly asking myself the same thing. But we have so many new digital tools that we could use. I think like just staying in constant communication, even though it's not like important organizational, like conversations about organizing or about anything like quote unquote important, just having a sense of community, even if it's virtually, is important. But even like that, this is why I say I don't have an answer, because that in itself is really time consuming, especially if you're running like an organization by yourself. Yeah, I don't know. I would love to hear from the other rest of the members of the cohort here. If you guys have ideas, it's tough.
I actually think it's funny because one of the people that I interviewed, one of the individuals I interviewed, made this as like a closing point of, you know, one of the last things that they recommended nonprofits to do, especially in food justice, with all of the food justice nonprofits that exist in Omaha and across the nation, is like, just imagine like if they were working together and applying themselves to, instead of chase money separately and chase like missions separately, if they really like work together, how would that look different? What would food justice even be like? Would we even know the term? So I think there's a lot of people thinking about that. And their recommendation was to create a nonprofit to connect nonprofits. But it's just, yeah, that's a whole cycle, and they were joking. But yeah, I think definitely Allegra with your recommendation of technology. And if we are in Omaha, you know, it's not too terribly big. It still feels a little bit manageable. I still run into people I know a lot. So yeah, I think it's super necessary. And I want to support this person in any way as they're like trying to do this, because it's so necessary.
We have one more really great question, and Corson, I thought of your contribution to the publication. Okay, the question is, you are all focused on people, groups, people and institutions, cultures of people without mention of nature. How does nature relate to your independent interests? And I'll just show Corson's, just it's texted an image from Corson's essay that is a personal essay, but also brings in historical photography and talks about the exploration of place. Corson, you don't have to respond, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I'm so sorry, you broke up a little bit reading the question, and I don't see it in the Q&A for some reason. Could you repeat that?
Oh, I saw it in the chat. It's the most recent one, came from Susan. And it says, you are all focused on people, groups, people and institutions, cultures of people without mention of nature. How does nature relate to your independent interests?
boy, I mean, I'm trying to think. I do have the sense that, I mean, a lot of the work that we do over the work, even thinking specifically about cultural institutions, a lot of people's work did end up dealing with nature quite a bit. I mean, I think any food justice work obviously is concerned with land use. I think there was work dealing with healing. There's mention as concerned with nature and that practice as well.
Mhm.
I guess as far as I don't know, the work that I contributed to the publication, that was sort of revisiting an essay thinking about genre as an institution, where a lot of times when we talk about cultural institutions, we mean physical buildings with people working inside them, collecting work. But I don't know, as far as a sociological institution is a little more broad, just anything that covers social norms. I think thinking about something like a genre like landscape photography is just as rigid and powerful a structure for governing social norms as museum is. And so that essay kind of focused on thinking about what does it look like to think about genre as an institution, to think about how the work we make is affected by legacies of environmental injustice. So I do think that there is, I don't know, I won't go through the whole thing here. It's in the book if you would like to see it, but those are, I don't know, a few things that I think we could point to in the book as having made that connection.
Absolutely. And land was really a big part of our discussions, talking about the history of colonization, talking about the place where we are. I think it's, to have a group of artists who have a connection to the city of Omaha, who have a connection to place, the people here, the land here, who are thinking about the history of this place. It was really, really fruitful. Even though we were on Zoom for most of our meetings, I do feel like that rootedness in place really shaped our discussions. This discussion went by really quickly. I really appreciate everyone for joining us today. I so appreciate this group. I hope you feel proud of the contributions that you've made. And I hope that, like the seeds in the back of the book, that this past year continues to percolate as you move forward in your practice. Everyone stay tuned. I know Peter has a few closing notes to share, but thank you everybody so much for being here and for participating.
Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to take a minute to first of all say thank you to our panelists, to Annika, to everybody who attended. We're really grateful to have had you all here tonight, and we're really grateful to have had you participate in this discussion with us. We want to give a special mention to Sarah Rowe and Lex JonAe, who weren't able to make it tonight, but they were really integral parts of our group, helped move discussions forward, contributed great projects to the book. So we hope that you'll take a minute to check out their contributions too, because they're pretty incredible. So thank you again all for coming. Thanks panelists, thanks Annika, and we'll see everybody soon.
Thanks everyone. See you soon.